Hello my friends and welcome to another episode of Genuine Chit-Chat. Just before the chat gets started, I want to let you know that this is a conversation with Mike Chen, the sci-fi author. He's written certain novels including Star Wars Brotherhood, a quantum love story. He's also been involved in these certain point of view novels. He's got a short story in Empire Strikes Back and in the Return of the Jedi versions as well. He's also written a huge amount of other incredible novels, including the upcoming Moon Knight Venom What If novel, which details are in the description for. So just make sure you check out Mike Chen's website in the description, his social media, the link to his Moon Knight Venom novel that's coming out this year, as well as my numerous other conversations with other Star Wars authors, including last year I spoke with Adam Christopher, Ethan Sachs, George Mann, and in the years prior there was also Kevin Shinnick, Cavan Scott and Claudia Gray. So if it's your first time on the show, hello there, welcome. Please subscribe, please like, leave a comment, tell us what you think, contact Mike Chen on social media, tell him how much you enjoyed this conversation, and make sure you check out the other Star Wars content that I release, including many episodes of Clone Wars Conversations. I release those once a month with Dave and Math, and we go through every episode of the Clone Wars. We've already done it for Star Wars Rebels, and we have plans in the future for other stuff as well. So please subscribe, please like, all that amazing stuff, and then strap in for an incredible conversation with Mike Chen. So my friends, I am here today with an author who's created a lot of different sci-fi content, a lot of sci-fi content I will say. He also loves to rescue animals. He is a massive fan of music, especially Britpop and indie rock and also punk rock and things. And it's an absolute delight really to be able to speak with this individual because they've got some really cool stuff coming up as well, which we will get into later in the year. But I am here with Mike Chen. Mike, it's so wonderful to have you on the show. Obviously I've done a lot of research into you, so I'm not going to ask you the questions of how you were when you got the Star Wars call, all those kinds of things, because they're amazing. But I've heard you say it several times, so I want to delve kind of deep into writing for a moment. I know you've been writing for a long period of time. I know that you've done you wrote comics when you were a kid about like the in between moments and things. So I want to kind of start there a little bit of what is it about the quiet moments that you really like? I know that as a writer you quite are emotionally and character driven, which comes out in the writing of yours that I've read, but I'm interested by the quiet moments because that's not something that people usually go to, and I'd love to hear you talk about it.
Yeah, it's just kind of where my brain always went, and I always find that like in TV shows or like in movies, like when they manage to squeeze them into the moments, like those are the things that I remember. It's like because I think you get to know the characters more, and I think like outside of I used to have this argument with a friend, like my best Star Wars friend growing up. He is this guy. I'm still friends with him, and like I named some of the Padawans in Brotherhood are named after his daughters.
Oh.
And so we would used to have like these arguments about like what are our favorite moments in Star Wars, and he would always say like the space battle in Return of the Jedi. And I'm like, Garrett, I give you that. Like, that is like the best space battle in Star Wars. Like, I would say even now, after however many films, it is the best space battle. I've possibly the Battle of Scarif in Rogue
That's pretty
One.
close.
Yeah, but Return of the Jedi is like it is amazing. Like flying through the Death Star surface and like moving through the objects and stuff. It's so kinetic. But then I always went back to like moments in Empire, like with Yoda on Dagobah or other things like that. And so like this hasn't been an argument that we've had for decades. And I think he probably has changed a little bit now that he's like an English high school teacher. And he talks about like character moments and stuff. But when we were teenagers, he would be like, that's nice, but it's kind of boring. And I'm like, no, that's the good stuff. And it's what separates Star Wars from, any direct to video, sci-fi action with no heart. It's like, yes, you can have like the greatest visuals in the world, but if the story doesn't mean anything, if the characters don't mean anything, then it doesn't really matter. And we would just kind of go back and forth on that. But I think that's something that I have carried with me my entire life. And growing up in the 80s, like to me, it was like the biggest difference between like an episodic animated series like the first generation of Transformers, which I loved, but I didn't love as much as Robotech, which for those people that don't know, Robotech is the Americanized version of Macross, which I'm sure everyone has heard of, Southern Cross, and Mospeada, which are so three anime series from the early 80s. but rewritten by a science fiction author to turn it into like a multi-generational epic. And I was like 7 years old when Robotech came out, and I had never seen serialized storytelling where my favorite characters died, and they fell in love, and there was romance, and like there were whole episodes about like the repair and reconstruction after something massive happens, like whether it's a battle or a main character death. Like there's an entire episode in like the first series of it where like one of the main characters dies, and there's a whole episode about grieving it. And it's like you don't get that like as a kid in the 80s. Like you don't get that. But like I think back to now, like why do I love Star Wars Rebels so much? And I think one of the most pivotal moments for me is the episode after Kanan dies, because we get to live with the Ghost crew as they go through like the worst thing impossible or imaginable, and they are still gearing up for like we have to defend Lothal. And I love being with the characters and seeing how they think through those moments. So I guess like it's just knowing that and understanding that it's like when they say as a writer it's like writing sex scenes, it's like the sex scenes are actually not that important. It's like the before and after, which I will say depends on your genre, because some people just want to read the sex scenes. but it's kind of like the same thing. Like the action can be important, but what is most important, at least for me and the types of stories that I like to experience, is like the before and after.
Yeah, you're very insightful there. I mean, I will say I love Star Wars Clone Wars, don't get me wrong, but Rebels is my personal favourite thing about Star Wars, apart from probably the High Republic and some of the literature. They're pretty close. But yeah, I say to people, like the Jedi Knight episode is like, that's horrendous, but it kills me, it hurts me. But the episode afterwards is the real heart-wrenching, because when you're watching Hera and Ezra like experiencing it,
and Chopper,
oh yeah, when you see Chopper sad, you're just like, I can't deal with this. It's like when you get like a big gruff character who's like impenetrable shell and they get upset, you're like, not you too. Amazing. Well, I mean, you brought up Star Wars, which is a perfect segue, because as people maybe just see in the background, I do have the Certain Point of View 2 novels and also Brotherhood. Now, I listened to this on audiobook and I enjoyed it so much I had to buy it physically, because I wanted to own it, and I thought,
appreciate the royalties from that.
It's all good. I mean, it's a fantastically written book, and it's an essential read, I'd say. I say to anyone who's a fan of the Clone Wars, they need to read that. There's Inquisitor Rise, The Red Blade by Delilah S. Dawson, that's amazing, and Brotherhood and that book both share a scene right at the start, the sort of knighting ceremony, and obviously the E.K. Johnston Queen's trilogy as well, where you said that was quite a big influence for you too. Now, you have not been shy with speaking about how much you enjoy Anakin. Now, obviously, in your Certain Point of View stories, the one in Return of the Jedi is about Anakin after he comes back from the light, and basically when Vader sort of passes on. Beautiful, incredible. And then the Empire Strikes Back one is about Palpatine, and a lot of that is about Anakin as well. So I want to ask you, I have a theory as to why you connect with Anakin so much. Now, I didn't know if you want to say why first, or if you want me to give you my prediction as to why.
Let's hear your prediction first.
Okay.
I'm curious.
Now, I don't want this in any way to be offensive, but it's from what you said in a prior podcast about the pressures that you experienced from your parents and things. And I wondered if you connected with Anakin and the Jedi in that regard due to the parallels and the pressures that you experienced in your youth. When there's Anakin having to do certain things, I know that, for example, you did your engineering degree, but you also did your creative writing one. With Anakin, he's someone who wants to do good, but he's quite emotional. That's one of the things. And because of the constraints of the Jedi and obviously his parental figures and things, he was in some ways, I wouldn't say necessarily isolated, but he couldn't express himself in the fullest ways that he could. And the story of Star Wars is basically going, that's not good for people, That's literally one of the main problems of the prequel era Jedi. So I wondered if you maybe connected with Anakin on that level, because he's someone who means well, but a lot of people in and outside the universe only perceive it from the negative elements. And I didn't know if that was something that you'd considered at all.
It wasn't. So I would say like yes and no. I realize, going back through a lot of my work, that unconsciously, like that sort of has kind of filtered into like almost all of my stories to some degree. And I think you'll find that like with a lot of authors, there's always going to be this like unconscious through line of what they're writing, and it's always them trying to like unwrap their childhood stuff. And so that's basically it. One of the things I have, I grew up with the original trilogy. And I was in college when the prequels started to come out. So I saw like, the rise and fall of like acceptance of the prequels in fandom. Um, but I have always very vehemently defended the prequels and defended Anakin. Like, and I've always said that like, yeah, there are definitely like if I could, I make this joke that if I could quantum leap into George Lucas circa 2000 and just like touch up the script to Attack of the Clones.
Well, you do it
Please
in
let me do
Brotherhood.
that.
In Brotherhood,
Yeah,
you do
I
that
do.
brilliant thing with Anakin, where it's like, God, wasn't that thing I said to Padme so cringy? It's like that's a great
Yeah.
way to do it.
Uh, um, because like I think like I really I love what I mean, I don't love what happened to Anakin because it's horrible, but I love the complexity that it has created. And I mentioned my Star Wars friend, growing up, like we had these arguments all the time after the prequels came out, and he's like, I don't get Anakin at all, and I'm like, part of it is the structure of the prequels, like the Clone Wars, like really fills it in, and it's kind of, I still go back and I feel like I love the Phantom Menace. I love Duel of the Fates. I love Qui-Gon Jinn. Qui-Gon Jinn is my
Mm.
favorite Jedi. But I think from if you wanted to give the film narrative justice without having to include the Clone Wars, what would have been better is the Phantom Menace is a novel, and then Attack of the Clones is episode one. Episode two is like something approaching the end of the Clone Wars, where kind of the time that's covered, but in the Siege of Mandalore,
Mm.
and then that is a cliffhanger that leads directly into Revenge of the Sith. I think that would have been an easier narrative for the public to consume. But this is the way that it is, and so like to me, like Clone Wars is vital. But even without that, just looking at the push and pull of everything that happens to Anakin, it's basically like he's constantly being told what to do or having things taken away from him or both of those things at once. And it gets to a point where he is getting opposing forces telling him what to do and taking things away from him. And he is a young person with like the weight of the galaxy on his shoulders as this is happening, and he's also being told like, no, you can't feel anything either, like feeling's bad. And I think it's such an interesting way to see how that can like, because if you look at what traumatizes people, what causes people to make bad decisions, what causes people to go to extremism, what causes people to go into like hate groups or things like that. And it really comes down to like this sort of like, major traumatic events and not having the emotional space and support system to get through it, and also having an abuser who systematically takes apart the support system that is there. And that is what happens to Anakin, except it's on a galactic scale. And I think that's so fascinating to unravel in a fictional character.
That's an amazing answer. And I will say, my fiance, she liked Star Wars a bit before I met her, but then I got her to watch the Clone Wars and Rebels and etc. like that. And she's always said she hates Mace Windu because she think in her mind, behind Palpatine, Mace is the main reason that Anakin turned. And every time there's like a Clone Wars interaction, or I tell her some of the description, like in Brotherhood, when there's that little bit of like, I think Mace Windu might hate me, and like there's little bits of that in the Clone Wars. She's like, it's your fault, Mace. It's like what you doing to Anakin. It's just that.
It's funny because like I when I say I love Mace Windu, I love Mace Windu for who he is, and like people will get. I have gotten some angry feedback where they say like Brotherhood is like Mace Windu slander, and I'm like, no, you have to remember that like it is written like the point of view in each chapter is very, very tight. So the way that Obi-Wan perceives the Anakin Mace relationship, he thinks like, oh well, Jedi can have interpersonal conflict too. Like that's like his very HR way of looking at it. Whereas Anakin is thinking like, I think this dude hates me, and he has done nothing but give me side eyes since like, I mean, if you go back to the Phantom Menace, Qui-Gon presents Anakin and he says like he's the chosen one, and the first reaction shot is Mace Windu going like, huh, like it's a complete side eye, and it is in the dialogue there. Like the two do not get along. Mace does not trust him, and the reason why Mace doesn't trust him is that he is, I guess, like the best and worst of the Jedi Order of that time, in that like all of the principles of the Jedi Order, he holds to them so closely that when the galaxy is functioning properly, that's totally fine. But the galaxy is rotten at its core, and he cannot see that. But that's not that doesn't mean I dislike the character. It just means that like he is representative. Like that's his purpose in Star Wars, is that he's representative of that. And so is Yoda. Yoda just kind of presents it a little bit differently, but I mean, you go back to Revenge of the Sith, where Anakin is like, I need help. Something bad is happening. And then Yoda's like, dude, just let it go. It's fine.
Yes. I always quote that bit.
Yeah, and it's like, I don't hate those characters. They're doing what is appropriate for them in the story right there. And like disagreeing with them on a functional level is part of storytelling. And so when you get Anakin's frustration with Mace in Brotherhood, it's in Anakin's perspective. It's like he's frustrated because like these two disagree, and they've always disagreed. And so I don't hate Mace Windu. I think Mace Windu is awesome, and that is why I brought over the stuff from the Tartakovsky series where he's like flattening the battle droids on Dantooine, because I think Mace Windu is awesome, but he also stands for something very, very specific in the prequel era, and that is central to the downfall of the Jedi.
I agree completely. I think he's an incredible character, and I think that Anakin and Mace are kind of the edge goalposts, where Anakin is like impulsive, but he takes action. He does what is right for people regardless of the consequences, whereas Mace is very dogmatic, very much the Jedi Order, and they work so well together. I mean, I would love, more content with those two together. I think one of the only things I think Clone Wars is kind of missing, the series that is, was like a full proper arc of the two of them together.
Yeah,
you had bits of it.
They have incidental connections, and like sometimes they're on a mission together, but you don't get like the full explosion that would be really, really interesting to have with them.
I agree completely, yeah. And I will say that the writing of Anakin in Brotherhood is phenomenal. And I know that you've commonly quoted sort of Matthew Stover's Revenge of the Sith novelization as a huge influence, and you use the Sun Dragon sort of parallels. And again, that appears in the Return of the Jedi certain point of view. So for me, I'd say to people, I mean, Brotherhood, as I've said, an essential read. And I think that a loose trilogy you could do. I know there's already kind of the Legends sort of Dark Lord trilogy, but I think if you did Brotherhood and then the Revenge of the Sith novelization, and then it's kind of cheating, but then your two certain point of view stories, I think those connect together to make a really great insight into Anakin, even beyond, obviously Clone Wars is a great way to do that as well. But yeah, I love the fact that you are so passionate about Anakin, and I really appreciate that, because, as I've gotten older especially, I'm like, you know what? I think a lot more people would be like Anakin than we realize, being in essentially a monastery where you're told not to experience emotion. And as you say, that Yoda moment where it's like, Yoda, I really need help. It's like, just don't forget it. Just don't worry. It's like,
and the thing is that, like, empathizing with Anakin doesn't mean that I agree with, the dude killed a lot of people,
including children.
Including children. I don't agree with that. But I can still think he's a totally fascinating, complex character. It's like I dropped off The Walking Dead before like Negan really became a full character on the show. But I know a lot of people really love him, even though they don't agree with him, and they love Jeffrey Dean Morgan's performance of him. And it's the same thing, where it's like you can appreciate the moral complexity of a character. It doesn't mean that you think what he does is a good thing.
I agree completely. We'll start to veer off Star Wars a bit, because there are many other things I do want to discuss. But one thing I want to ask, because you're so into music, I didn't know if this is a question you've considered, but or maybe while you're writing Brotherhood, if you thought of this, are there any songs or artists that you think Obi-Wan, Anakin, Padme, Mill, Rue, Asajj, anyone in Brotherhood that you think either would represent them, or when you hear them, you kind of think of those? Because I know music is such a big part, and I have friends who are authors who have like soundtracks when they're writing new books. They're like, I'm just going to listen to these 3 albums or this one artist. I didn't know if you had anything that connected to either Brotherhood or anything that you just think of that kind of connects music to anyone in Star Wars.
Not Star Wars, I will say, because like for me, Star Wars is, Kevin Kiner and John Williams.
I mean, John Williams is, don't get me wrong, George Lucas, amazing, brilliant man, but we've got to say, I think John Williams is probably the next person down as who's responsible for Star Wars, what it is today. Yeah. Not to mention all the other stuff amazing he's done, but yeah, sorry.
So it's like, it is always jarring for me when I see, and it's nothing wrong with it, but like for me, it doesn't work when I see, people make like music videos of modern music set to like Star Wars scenes. Like, I get why people do it, and like I enjoy it in other forms, like with other franchises. But for me personally, it just doesn't work. It always has to be either John Williams or Kevin Kiner's music, and that's just like this weird personal bias I have towards Star Wars. So like what I did with like when I was writing that is like I would just put on Attack of the Clones, Clone Wars, and Revenge of the Sith. Like that's basically it. I think about Anakin's dark moments. I think of the Battle of the Heroes, and then I think of like Padme's ruminations when he's like having quiet moments. But then also like I know it's not on the soundtrack album, and I never figured out why, but the opening of Revenge of the Sith with like the war drums, like I think of that like whenever like I'm writing Anakin and he's like getting ready to do something, that's sort of like the doom doom, like that's what I think about. So yeah, it's like my soundtrack for those characters is definitely just like Star Wars music.
I mean, the music of Star Wars is such an integral part of it. And, when you think of not just John Williams, because there's been other individuals who have been important in cinema, but when you go, what are the iconic theme tunes? Oh, well, Superman. Oh, John Williams. Oh, okay. Indiana Jones. Oh, wait, John Williams. Wait, Jurassic Park? John Williams.
Jurassic Park.
E.T.?
Exactly.
And you're like, what? And you just think, what? It's just almost not a coincidence, because I'm making the point here of just like almost anything he writes the soundtrack to becomes this big iconic thing because memories are so interlinked with music and stuff, which I love. Well, to finish off the little Star Wars thing then, this is a very abstract question, very ambiguous. You can answer it as much or as little as you want, but
okay.
What is Star Wars? And what is Star Wars to you? When you think, if someone says, what is Star Wars? What's the kind of the first thoughts that come to you? It can be a person, it can be a scene, it can be what it means to you, a definition, anything at all. As ambiguous as you like. What is Star Wars?
I mean, to me, where I always go to for Star Wars, and I know this is different for everyone. I always go to Anakin and Obi-Wan. I think like they're so central to Star Wars, and I will say, as much as like I having written Anakin and been in his head for several years to try to write him, even after watching the prequels and watching the Clone Wars and reading other people write Anakin, I did always feel there was a little bit of a divide between Anakin and Vader until the Obi-Wan show. And now I cannot unsee it. It's like every scene with Vader, I think like, oh my God, that is such an Anakin thing to do. It's like if they are fully synthesized in my head. So yeah, like when I think of Star Wars, like the first thing I think about is Anakin and Obi-Wan. And I know for some people it's like it's Rey and Kylo, or it's Luke and Yoda, or it's Han Solo and smuggling, and it's like everyone can have their own thing for that. But for me, it is those two.
And together they were unstoppable.
That's right. Still waiting to see if someone's going to get a tattoo of that line.
Well, funny, I haven't got a tattoo of that line, I will say, but I do. I'm a big prequel baby. So I'm wearing a Clone Wars t-shirt.
Excellent.
But also, I'm one of the, like, my friends mocked me when I got this, which shows the prequel love. But like, you might be able to see it there.
That is cool.
Anakin and Obi-Wan. Oh, terrible for audio, but oh god, there you go. So for me, Revenge of the Sith, oh god, is is for me is Star Wars. I love it all, and I think all the films, all 11 of them, are, including the Clone Wars movie, are brilliant in their own ways. Clone Wars movie is my least favourite movie, I'd say. But I love the prequels. I'm a prequels baby, so I grew up with them. I've always known Star Wars with both trilogies, and that's one of the reasons why I was so excited to speak to you, because Brotherhood is just incredible. Clone Wars content, prequel era content, any of it. I've loved prequels since I was a kid. I was amidst the people who got mocked for it, and then the new generation have come in and they all love the prequels. But it's like, yes. And people like yourself and Delilah S. Dawson and even Matthew Stover and James Lucino, the people who've enjoyed the prequels and are passionate about it and are creating content around it to make it more accessible for other people. I think Clone Wars spun that off a lot. But obviously some of those other books came out before. But I want to thank you for those elements in themselves. So we'll take a bit of a turn, because you haven't just written Star Wars. You and I could speak about Star Wars, I think, for the entire podcast. But I do want to promote
hours.
Easily. But I want to promote some of the other stuff that you were doing and things. So I read the first chapter of Quantum Love Story today.
Thank you.
No worries. Well, I did it to prepare to speak with yourself. I wanted to get a taste of some of the things you've been up to. And I'm saying this on a podcast, so I'm held to it. I'm going to buy Quantum Love Story. I was going to ask you if there's anywhere that you'd want people to start with your books, if they've either read Brotherhood or they're not fussed by Star Wars necessarily. Which of your novels would you direct them to? Either the ones that's the most accessible or your favorite or anything. Quantum Love Story will say amazing. And I again, the first chapter was so good, and I love a time loop. I'm a massive sucker. Groundhog Day, Palm Springs, Edge of Tomorrow. Literally, as soon as I heard you speaking about that, I was like, I need to get it. And I read the chapter and I'm like, as soon as payday hits, I'm buying it, because I'm trying to read more content from Star Wars authors I speak to, and I'm trying to promote stuff that isn't just their Star Wars work. So I wondered, I know you've got the Venom Moon Knight What If book coming out later this year.
Yeah, that's going to be fun.
I am so stoked for that. Venom and Moon Knight are my two favorite characters. I read the comics of them, and I love the movies and the shows and things. So I'm very stoked about that. But putting that to one side, what would you recommend to people if they want to get into more of the Mike Chen bibliography?
So what I will say is that when they asked me to write the book that became Brotherhood, they said they were picking me specifically because they wanted a very character-focused story based on, and they picked me because I had established that with my original work. So the way that I tell people, when you look at my catalog, and if you're looking for a place to start, each of the books is kind of like, I try not to write in the same subgenre twice. So you can pick based on what subgenre tickles your fancy the most. So my first book is called Here and Now and Then. It's probably the most well-known of my original work. It's definitely the best-selling one. And that is a time travel father-daughter story that is heavily influenced by Doctor Who.
Nice.
My second book is called A Beginning at the End. It is a post-pandemic book that came out in January 2020, which is like the worst marketing of all time.
I was going to say.
That was not good. I mean, I had a lot of awkward press for that. And, even still, 4 years into COVID existing in our world, I have some people who have told me, this book really helped me heal and process some of the trauma of that time. And I have had other people come up and say, I've read all your books except that one. I can't do it. And I'm like, that's totally fine. I totally understand that. My third book is called We Could Be Heroes. And it is a superhero tale where the pitch is a superhero and supervillain decide that they're better off as best friends instead of rivals. God. And it was heavily influenced by the Marvel Netflix shows like Jessica Jones, and also the DC Arrowverse, particularly Legends of Tomorrow and Arrow. So if you're really into that kind of stuff, that's a good book for you. My fourth book is called Light Years from Home, and that is for X-Files fans. And the pitch is, if you took an X-Files alien abduction case, but instead of focusing on Mulder and Scully, you focus on the family it happened to and how it impacts them over decades. So that's for, if you like X-Files, I think you'll find that really right up your alley. My fifth book was called Vampire Weekend. It is for anyone who, like me, grew up reading Anne Rice and also finding solace in goth music and punk music. But it's also essentially a story of being a child of immigrants and like the external pressures that puts on you and not knowing how to deal with that, except with vampires and music. Um,
As
so if you like,
autobiographical as you get without being too autobiographical, I
that's
suppose you
right.
say.
Yeah, except I'm not. I wish I was a vampire, but I am not.
Still time.
Yes. So if there's a vampire listening to this, please come to San Francisco and fucking turn me, please. um, so if you like vampires, especially the like some of the more modern like down to earth interpretations of it, like one of the biggest influences of that was the series Being Human. There's a British version and an American version. I love both. And that's very much kind of like the vibe of Vampire Weekend. And then my latest novel is A Quantum Love Story, which is a time loop, but it's a little different. Most time loops are a single person, 24 hours. This is two people in a 4-day span. So they really have some time to breathe and not just think like, what do we have to do to get out of the time loop, but also what are the benefits of actually being in the time loop? Like one of the things that they talk about is, wait a minute, our bank accounts reset, our health resets. What can we do with that to actually enjoy this time and get to know each other? So, and that is my entire catalog leading up to October's Moon Knight and Venom book.
Which as I said, I'm so excited for that. And when you're doing press for that, you can come back on the show because a lot of my listeners and I, big Moon Knight fans. In fact, I've got here, for more Funko Pops, I've got Venomized Groot and also nice. Mr. Knight. So nice. it's one of those things where I've read loads of the Venom comics, I'm a fan of the movies, and I did a whole Moon Knight retrospective with a friend of mine who actually wrote a Moon Knight promote him as well. His name is Scott Weatherly. Him and a bunch of others wrote essays about Moon Knight.
Oh, cool.
Which is a really, really cool book. It's really, really interesting. There's someone who has a dissociative identity disorder, and they've contributed to the book and talked about how the series kind of impacted them and stuff. So really, really cool stuff. I love that. So why don't you talk a little bit of what you can say, because obviously it's still quite a while off yet. What can you say about the What If Moon Knight Venom novel? And then we'll delve into that another time when I have you back on.
Yeah, actually, so the same publicist who did Brotherhood and does a lot of the Star Wars stuff, Lauren Ely, she's doing that series too. So just get in touch with her when you want, when time comes. Probably if you reach out to her in like August, we could probably get things scheduled. What I can say about this, it is book 3 of a connected What If series. Book 1 just came out. That's the one on Loki. What if Loki was worthy? Book 2 is it's Wanda Maximoff and Peter Parker. It's primarily Wanda. And so there is an overarching narrative in there involving like a mysterious villain / external force. I can't say too much, but if you read the first Loki book, like you will get glimpses of it. Like we definitely, as authors, were put together and talk to like how do we connect our pieces together. For Moon Knight and Venom, or the official title is What If Mark Spector Was a Host to Venom? One of the tricky things is you have Moon Knight, so you have Mark, Steven, and Jake in one head, and that's a lot of voices in a head. And then you also have Khonshu, talking to them too. And then you bring Venom into there, and that's another voice talking in their head. And how do you tell a story with that? And so I can't say anything until they've actually start to release, some publicity material for it. And I don't know what they're going to spoil with that. But the narrative question of like, how are we going to tell this story is answered within a few chapters of the book. And then this book really starts to get going. I can say that one of the big inspirations for how I wrote the Moon Knight characters is the 2016 Moon Knight run. And some of the creators in that get shout outs as names of security guards in the book. That's how I Easter egged them. And then the 2018 Venom run, and then obviously like the films and the TV series like are not like official influences, but like I definitely looked at a lot of photos of Oscar Isaac when I was describing things, and I rewatched the Venom movies. These books are written to be accessible to people who may not have read all the comics but have watched the TV show or the Venom movies, and want more out of that. So there's a lot of, I will say, the interplay between them is really fun because you have these different personalities, who all have like their own kind of agenda and quirks, and I just God, it's hard to talk about this without spoiling things.
You
And
don't
I
have
don't
to
know
say
what I'm
anymore. I
allowed
don't
to
want to
say.
put you. I don't want to make you get
Yeah,
you in trouble, but I will say.
I kept
Go.
asking, like, can I do this? Can I include this? Can I allude to this? And I was surprised at how much they said yes to. Though I will say there's one more round of revision going on, and so it could come back and then where they say like we actually decided we can't do this at all. But yeah, the strength, I think the strength of the book is like the relationships between like all the different permutations there, between Mark and Jake and Steven, and Venom and Mark, and Khonshu and Venom, which is funny. So yeah, it's really cool. Like I know the first read from the editorial team, everyone was very happy with that, and just making sure that it's like it's a psychological thriller, but it's also very character driven, and there's a lot of you get the best out of the characters and the worst too, but that's like in a good way.
Well, that's what you want, and like I will say, the Venom movies, I enjoy them. They're not perfect, but my favorite thing about Venom 2 is the humor side, is the buddy,
Yes.
the buddy comedy side of things. And with
Yes.
Moon Knight, some of the cool effects and things with Khonshu and etc. are great, but the scenes where Steven and Mark are having a back and
Yes.
forth, especially when
Yeah.
there's like another person there being like, what's happening? Like, they're my favorite moments. And so with someone like yourself who specializes in characters and does so well to get into the heads of characters, if only to go by what you've written in Star Wars, I know you've written a lot more, I'm so excited, because they're two of my favorite characters. And the amount of different things in comics where Venom or a type of Venom has connected with different people,
Yeah.
like the fact of that. And then with Moon Knight, I'd never even considered it. And one of the things that's really nice you said there is that people don't have to have consumed all the other comics, because I love Star Wars, I love Marvel, I read a fair amount of comics, but you go, hey, I want to get into Spider-Man. Oh, it's 1,200 issues on the Amazing Spider-Man run. How on earth could I get into this? It's like, you couldn't read that in a lifetime. So the fact that it's its own kind of thing, and again, nods to other stuff, but stands on its own, is something I think that Marvel, and to some degree Star Wars as well, really do need, which I really, really appreciate that, and I can't wait.
I think like with this series, like you can basically have only watch the MCU, and not even the full MCU. It's like you just kind of have to know, like, what is Tom Hiddleston's Loki, like what's his general arc, what is Wanda's arc, who is Peter Parker, and then for my book, like, so these are not MCU tied in. But like, the sort of accessibility is like, the characters from the MCU, so you can pick this up and know what's happening. So there's definitely a level of accessibility there, and getting Venom's humor in there was really important. And there are like when I was going through the notes from the editorial team, and they're like, this is my favorite line, I'm like, that's my favorite line too. And it's like, so it was, at first, because you have to have like conflict between Venom and the characters, and so like it was like a natural progression of like working that humor into there, because the comfort level between Venom and the Moon Knight identities grows over time, and there's like definitely a conscious tipping point as a writer where it's like Venom's telling jokes now, like they're getting along. So, and I don't think I can say any more than that, because that would reveal like how narrative goes.
Well, that's completely. You've given me way more than I realized. I tried not to look into it a little bit because I was like, I don't want to. I also don't want to spoil it for myself. But you've given just the perfect amount of tease, exactly the kind of stuff I want to hear. So I will not press you any further. So let's take a bit of a turn and talk about something which is very dear to your heart, which is music, which we've already touched upon a little bit. So I've got a note here, which is obviously you love Doctor Who, which is really cool. But you said a lot of your music is kind of anglicized in certain respects. Did you get into? I know your dad was a big sci-fi nerd himself, but like, did you get into Doctor Who and then that got you into sort of British music as well, or are they two completely separate things that just happen to be British?
They're very separate things. Like, so Doctor Who, I remember seeing in America, we have the public television stations, like PBS. I remember seeing Tom Baker at random times on the PBS station and being like, what is this? And it's like and then like I would see merch or like occasional books or whatever, like in my local comic shops. Like I got the sense, like I understood, like the dude with the scarf and the hat is a time traveler and he flies around in a phone booth. Like I got that general gist of it. I didn't really get absorbed into Doctor Who until David Tennant's run, when it was being broadcast over here, first on Sci-Fi Channel and then BBC America. And then when it got on Netflix and I could just start it, I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. And then I went back, and because like with any franchise that I get into, like I want to devour all of it. I want to understand all of it. So I went back and I watched as much classic Doctor Who as I could. And so now it's just kind of like this massive part of my brain, kind of exists in there. And what I really love about Doctor Who is like it has this really deep mythology, but in a way it doesn't even really matter. It's not like, Star Trek and Star Wars where it's like they have to kind of exist within the parameters of their canon. I love how it's like every few years, like the canon for Doctor Who twists. And then, it's just like, you have a problem with that? Okay, that's fine. Well, we'll just do a standalone episode of the monster anyway. So
wibbly wobbly, timey-wimey.
Exactly.
That's the ultimate explanation.
Like, I remember like during the Stephen Moffat's era, like he was at a Comic-Con and someone asked him like, is the Big Finish like audio dramas and like the previous books, like, are they canon? And he goes, it's all canon and none of it is canon. It doesn't even really matter. And I'm like, that's the best answer. And I love Doctor Who for being able to do that. I love how like the first episode with Ncuti is like, you could have never seen Doctor Who before in your life, and you can jump into this and be like, this dude is amazing. I love this. Or you could go into it with like knowing, obscure episodes from the Patrick Troughton era and still be like, this dude is amazing. I love this. That's what I love about Doctor Who. But it's completely separate from music. For me, it was very much, I talked about my book Vampire Weekend about like, the main character is a child of immigrants and she doesn't know quite how to handle like the pressures or the expectations of it. And so she finds punk rock in the 70s and that's what she turns to, but then she becomes a vampire. In the parallel to my story is that like, I found sci-fi as a child. But then when I was like 12 or 13 and I discovered punk rock and indie rock, it really spoke to me. And I realized after decades of therapy now, it's because through that music, it allowed me to access feelings that like my parents who, being immigrants and coming from a culture where like they didn't talk about their feelings, like I was never given the tools to do that. But then I could listen to Joy Division or Depeche Mode or, like a lot of like the bands from that era. And like, I'm angry, so I'm going to listen to The Clash, or like I'm sad and I'm going to listen to Joy Division, or like I'm confused and I'm going to listen to Throwing Muses. Like that gave me the outlet for that. And so like, 60 to 70% of like, my favorite bands are English. And so when I went to, when I was in college, so I didn't become a vampire, I became an engineering student instead. And between my second and third years of college, I did a study abroad program and I lived in London for a few months. And I remember like, some people in the program took it really seriously and were like, we're here to learn about like London history and literature. And like, I was like, no, I'm here to go clubbing and to go see Pulp at Finsbury Park. And
Yes.
like, so like there's a video that Pulp released of their Finsbury Park concert from '98, and I was there. That's like one of my big like Britpop claims to fame. But like I went clubbing probably like 3 nights a week, all over London. Like I saw shows, and then when I like afterwards, after I graduated, I did a work visa in London. I lived like in London again for a few months, and like some people when they get the work visa program, they're like, "Oh, are you going to get like an internship to support your career?" And I'm like, "No, fuck it. I'm a bartender. I'm a bartender, and our downstairs has a club night on Sunday nights, and it's indie rock night, and I'm going to go clubbing, and I'm going to go to shows, I'm going to drink." Um, and it's all based around like my love of English music. Like I went to the like I've during my time studying there were like three other really big music people there, and we did like a field trip where we took the tube out like 45 minutes or some to like like industrial outskirts of London to go to the Mute Records shop, and we just bought a bunch of like Depeche Mode merchandise at their shop, and it's like we made a whole day about it. Like we would go record hunting in the Camden markets, and it was just like as obsessive as I am about sci-fi. That is how I feel about music, and that's how I still feel about music. And one of the things that like so with COVID, um, my wife has an immune condition, so like there are some things that I just can't do. And like the thing that like I don't care about not eating inside restaurants anymore. It's California, you can eat outside, it's totally fine. But I miss being in a club squished with like 500 sweaty people like singing along to like to an indie band. It's like I could go to a stadium show and that's like perfectly safe from a COVID perspective, but to me it's boring. It's like even when I see my favorite bands like in an arena or a stadium show, it's not the visceral experience that like seeing a small working band inside a club. Like it is just a completely different experience. So like I desperately miss that. Like that is like my only real like regret of like this era. That is my big spiel on music.
No, I mean, I'm going to ask more questions so you can say more about it. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm in the similar boat, Star Wars is my thing. It connects with I lost my father like 10 years ago, but he always loved Indiana Jones and Star Wars. I think he liked to think of himself as a Han Solo kind of character. He wasn't really, but I think he liked to think of himself like that. So I think when he passed away, which was before even the sequels were announced, it was really close. So for him, it was always just the original 6. He never watched the Clone Wars or anything like that. It was just those 6 movies and then the 4 Indiana Jones movies. Mm-hmm. And so I think that when Force Awakens came out, I inadvertently just kind of imprinted almost on it. I was like, I used to watch Star Wars a lot with my dad. And so that's kind of, Star Wars and sci-fi has always connected me with dad, and he's a big movie buff, and I've got DVDs and Blu-rays and stuff all around me. But the other thing is music. My dad was in bands when he was younger. I've got 2 older brothers who are quite a bit older than me, 17 and 20 years older than me, so I'm very much the youngest. But like one of my brothers in bands as well, and the first gig I went to was one of his. Second gig was Alice Cooper, which I was very chuffed about. And I was like 16, what a gig that was. But music for me, yeah, it's so visceral. And my fiance, she is into music, but she likes a lot more pop stuff and a lot more chill stuff. I'm a bit more like you. I want to go to a gig where there's like 500 people in this tiny random bar, and it's just all energy, and some people just don't get it. And
yes,
like my fiancée Megan, she's like, I love her to pieces, and she likes to sit in an arena, sit down and watch a band. And I'm like, I genuinely, there's a band, Muse. I love Muse, but there was an opportunity to go see Muse, but all the standing tickets were gone. It was only seated, and I was like, don't want to go. And she was like, you serious? I was like, why
totally
would I sit?
get that.
It's the energy.
For someone who loves Muse. So when I was, my wife and I got like, she's a big Star Trek and Star Wars nerd. Like she's a big sci-fi person too. But we came together because of music. That's how we found each other at the time. And we DJ'd between like 2000. I played in bands from like 2000 to 2010 in the Bay Area. I DJ'd an indie rock dance night from like 2000 to about 2005. And my wife would sometimes help out with that. And so like we played Muse when Sunburn came out. Like, so even
Mm.
before that, and so like we would play Sunburn, and people were like, "Who's this band?" I'm like, "Well, if you like Radiohead, if you like the Benz era of Radiohead, you'll really like this." And then they just fucking exploded.
Oh yeah.
But I totally get that. I feel like I think the band that I have seen the most, I know it's not cool to say you enjoy them anymore, but like I recognize how mediocre U2 has become, and I still think will defend like their back catalog up to a certain point, and they are the band that I have seen the most, and they are an incredible live band no matter what era you see them in. However, when I saw them, for almost every time I saw them was like they arranged their stage shows so there's like a pit area that like 500 people can get in, and then the rest of it is like arena, seating. And seeing them in like a club type environment is like a life changing experience. Seeing them seated is just like, oh, I'm just watching a band, and it's like I try to explain that to someone, and like they don't get it, and it's like the energy is very very different, and I feel like for probably about 5 to 7 years of the times like my wife and I were together, like we saw a band at like the Fillmore or the Warfield or Bimbo's or Great American Music Hall like almost every week. And if we didn't go see a band that week, we were clubbing that week. And there's just people either get it or they don't. I have one of my closest friends was like, why does music have to be so important to you? Why can't it just be like fun? And I'm like, no, you don't get it. It's music is like about emotion and life and expression. And he's like, dude, you're weird. It's fine.
Well, I mean, I'm weird, and weird's not a bad
Yeah.
thing. But like a lot of my friends we're all musically connected. We all like a lot of the same stuff. But yeah, there's certain people I knew. One of my old bosses at a place I used to work years ago. It was in a cassette and CD production company. Okay,
Oh,
one of
wow.
the very few ones left, and I did graphic design and stuff for them. And he said at one point, he was like, I just don't get live music. And I'm like, right, first of all, you're in a music production company, so what are you doing? And second of all, I was like, have you ever been and seen a band live? He's like, no. And I was like, there you go. And he's like, but
Yeah.
you're just standing in a room with loads of sweaty strangers and listening to music that's too loud. And I'm like, you're that's like saying, oh yeah, oh, food. I know you're not the biggest foodie, but it's like saying to someone who's really into food, chocolate, it's just cocoa beans and sugar.
Yeah,
So, well, yeah,
that's funny because like my wife is the foodie, and she will have like that same sort of argument with me where she's like, do you taste like why this like is the most amazing curry you've ever had? I'm like, it's pretty good curry, but I don't know.
it's not a
But
burrito.
like, yeah, it's like that is but I am that way with music where it's like I I I don't like if I'm going to see a new band, I want to digest their catalog first because I want to feel it. You know, I don't want it to be like I'm just sampling them. Like if I'm going to see them, I want to experience them. And so and some people they're like, I'm just fine standing there drinking my beer in the back, and I'm like, I don't get that. And but I think that's like with music people, you're either that way or you're not. you know. I will say, and as someone who like I'm teaching my daughter to play guitar, and I'm trying to teach her to like she has her favorite bands now that I've introduced her to. It's like she likes Always, and she likes the Beths, and she likes David Bowie, and she likes Ladytron, um, and she's starting to ask about like when can I go see a show, and I'm like. She goes like some of her classmates, like, they're really into Taylor Swift. And I'm like, more power to Taylor Swift. She is getting young girls to like pick up guitars and appreciate music, and that's fine. But like I'm telling her, like, you're probably like the bands that you have started to like, your friends are not really going to maybe appreciate them until like maybe 10 years from now, if that. But that doesn't mean that you can't really enjoy them. And then once you get to see them in a small space like this, I think your life is going to change. And I'm hoping she is one of those people that really gets it because, like, as so, like going to a stadium show, it's like I feel like you don't capture music
Agree.
that way. It's like yes, like from a capitalism perspective, like that is how you get it out to the masses, and it's become this huge, like, entertaining multimedia show. But I feel like it's a show. It's not a concert. Those are different things.
Or it's like a show, not an experience.
Yes,
You go
yeah,
and
yeah,
see a show, but you experience like a gig is what we call it over here. So for me, a
yeah.
gig is a show where basically you can walk up to the stage and there's the band there. You can almost grab them. Sometimes there's barriers, but it's really small. You're kind of uncomfortable, but that's the beauty of it, is you go to
Yes.
this dingy random little place with this, you have a drink or something if you desire, but really you're just there in this essentially crappy little room watching a band play, and they don't even have to be playing necessarily that well, but it's the energy, and it's
Yes,
always the smaller
exactly.
bands, and it's hard because like I don't want to be a hipster, but sometimes you get a band who are like, these are amazing, I love seeing them in this tiny little venue, and then they become really big and you're like, but if I go see them in that big venue, it costs triple the amount. They won't play half as many of their decent songs. They'll only play big singles, not the deep cuts. And then
Yes.
also, I might even have to be sat down or so far back that I can't feel it.
Sitting down, yeah, it's like sitting down for a concert does not make any
I can't
sense.
fathom it. I'm like, just watch it at home. Just watch a recording of it at home. I'm not nothing
I would
against.
say the only artists that I have seen multiple times in like arenas or really large theaters that I like had that sort of like visceral feel of like this is important to me was seeing David Bowie. Seeing
Oh,
David
so
Bowie
jealous.
was like I saw him in a theater in Berkeley, at the arena in San Jose, and also at the Shoreline Amphitheater, and there's just something magical about him. And so even though like the majority of people were seated, it's still like we are in a room with David Bowie, and you just kind of feel like everything's elevated. But it was like I said, like seeing U2 live is an experience even if you only know their singles. I had very little interest in like their weird Vegas Sphere show because I'm like, that's not why I would go see a band. It's like, I understand like they're riffing off of like their 90s concert productions, but to me, it's like I would rather they take that time and, play 10 shows at a theater. And like that's where I would pay the money to see them. And it's like the same thing with like Bruce Springsteen or something like that. It's like have them do a residency in a theater, and I guarantee you those are life-changing experiences, as opposed to like, yeah, that was a cool thing that I paid $40 for a beer for, and and I watched a bunch of colors on come up on in front of me. But it's like it's not what music is to me. And so when getting back to writing, when I wrote Vampire Weekend, I very much wanted to like convey that and like, make that very central to the character's point of view. And there's a moment in there where, so this character takes like her, like, the person thinks that like the main character is just like her like slightly older aunt, but it's really like, because she's a vampire, it's like multi-generational generations down. But she takes him to his first gig, and she goes into this thing about like, your first concert has to be like an experience with like where the band and you're standing there. And she notices that like he goes from just standing there to like experiencing it. And that was me very much proselytizing to like, this is what music should be. And I have had music people, when they read that, they've messaged me and they're like, you captured it. This is what I feel at a concert. I'm like, okay, this book is for you. So like, there's going to be people who don't get that, and that's totally fine, but this book is for you.
Now, what that sounds like to me is that I'm going to be buying 3 Mike Chen novels this year. I'm going to be buying, because I've already said, I'm going to be buying Quantum Love Story for all the music stuff you've sold me. I'm going to have to get Vampire Weekend, and I can't not get the Moon Knight. I know it's going to be, it's not strictly speaking called Moon Knight. It's What If, Mark Spector, met Venom, essentially. But I'm definitely down for all of those things, so I cannot wait. So just before we wrap up here, I've got one more question for you, and then you can do the your plugs and stuff. I know we've already kind of done it, but we'll have a final little one. But this question, it might be a bit of a deep cut. It might be an easy answer. It's, how has fatherhood affected your writing, if at all?
Well, from a practical perspective, it changed my schedule.
more vampire writing, night writing.
Yeah,
and things.
it definitely, like, I became much more tired. I think there's a few different things about it's like when writing about family relationships, I always you kind of start off taking like what you bring into it with like your parents and your siblings and things like that, and then when you become a parent, that brings a whole different perspective into things, and an understanding of like what's important, what's not important. And so that naturally shifts, I think, your perspective with everything, and that's going to filter into your art. I would say also, like, from like the stories that I am exposed to. So my daughter's 9 now. But there was a lot of stuff when she was like between the ages of 3 and 6 that like I would not have watched if I didn't have her, and a lot of like modern Disney stuff. And I'm like, Moana is like one of the greatest movies ever made, and like
100%.
I would not have experienced that if it wasn't for her. So like getting like a lot of it's it's just kind of
It's all right.
cheaply made. We're turning it out for Amazon's kids network, and so they can have good metrics. But then there's some stuff where I'm like, I would have never known this existed, and like this has become somewhat influential. Like you as a writer, you take influence from everything that you absorb, and I can definitely point to things where I'm like, some of this is from Moana. It's like that sort of stuff where it's like I wouldn't have known this existed because it was never part of my sphere. So it's interesting seeing that like becoming a parent as kind of like filtered in for both like the emotional, but then also like the practical aspects of storytelling.
That's a very, very good answer. And yeah, I would agree. I think Moana is not only arguably the best Disney film, it is one of the best films ever made. It's phenomenal on every level.
Yeah.
And the music's amazing and really different. So it makes it even better. Well, Mike, you've been very generous with your time. Do you want to do just your final plugs where people can find you? I'll put details in the description before I hang up this call.
So, my social media handle is always Mike Chen Writer. You have to make sure writer is in there because there are several public people named Mike Chen in the world. The platform that I use seems to keep shifting every few months because Twitter is a disaster right now. So right now I am the most active on Threads. I was on Blue Sky for a little bit, but Blue Sky just was not gaining the community that I wanted. Except for Blue Sky had a really good Star Trek community, so I'm urging those people to come over to Threads. But that's where I'm at right now. I'm also on Instagram, and because we didn't have a dog for a few years, but then we got a new dog, and so now my Instagram is finally just active again because it's just photos of my dog.
Jake the dog.
So Jake the dog, yes. Jake the dog Sisko Lockley is his full name. So Jake the dog from Adventure Time, Jake Sisko from Star Trek Deep Space Nine, and Jake Lockley from Moon Knight.
It's amazing stuff. Well, if I manage to have you on the show again, we'll have to talk about animals because I know you like rescue animals. You've got cats. There's been dogs, the corgis in Brotherhood as well. Lots of great stuff. But we'll wrap this up now. I want to ask you something quick off air before I end the call. But thank you so much, Mike, for being here. I hugely, hugely appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
And that's the end of the episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. As always, my friends, please, if you're on YouTube, like and subscribe. Even leave comments on your thoughts. If you're on any other podcast player, please follow the feed, leave reviews, especially if you're on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or Audible, and obviously share on social media where you can, especially share on social media and tag Mike Chen, telling him how much you enjoyed this conversation. And who knows, maybe I'll have Mike Chen on again. That would be a lot of fun because I'm sure there's loads of other things to talk about, including many of his future releases. So make sure you check out the links in the description to check out Mike's website, as well as that article on the Venom Moon Knight What If novel that he's got coming out later in 2024. I also mentioned this in the intro, but please make sure you check out my other Star Wars conversations. I've spoken to several Star Wars authors, including Adam Christopher in December 2023, and then Ethan Sachs and George Mann, and I think maybe Kevin Shinnick also in 2023, and then Kevin Scott and Claudia Gray in the years prior to that. I've also spoken to Paolo Villanelli, who's an artist who worked with Ethan Sachs on the Star Wars Bounty Hunters run, and I've also spoken to Alex Molly Damon of Star Wars Explained, plus loads of other Star Wars conversations. Every month I'm doing Clone Wars conversations with my friends Dave and Math, and occasionally my fiancée Megan pops in. They're all on YouTube, as well as on the feeds of Comics in Motion, Genuine Chit-Chat, and Star Wars Comics in Canon. So in any of those places, you can hear myself, Dave, and Math go through every episode of Star Wars The Clone Wars. We currently are on Series 3, I think. We've released Series 3 Part 1. Series 3 Part 2 will be out in a few weeks' time, and we're recording Series 4 Part 1 very shortly. So we're going through all those episodes, and we do have plans to continue with the films after that, as well as The Bad Batch, Tales of the Jedi, and Tales of the Empire. So make sure you subscribe, because at least once a month, you will get a Star Wars bit of content from myself, as well as any other Star Wars conversations I have with people such as Mike Chen. But what else have we got coming up? Well, I think next week is episode 2 of Monthly M&M. So myself and Megan have started doing a monthly show where we talk about a random topic for at least 30 minutes. The first episode was just about hair, like hairstyles we've had, colours, facial hair, and some of the stigmas around, especially female body hair, so that was a fun one. Episode 2 is about pantomimes, especially because Megan actually performed in a pantomime. Any of you American listeners probably don't know what a pantomime is. Well, it's a perfect podcast to get in tune to find out what it is. It's a very specifically British theatrical production. Megan had her first experience on stage doing a pantomime and is now doing another theatrical production. She's doing a musical. So really, really fun stuff there. So if you want to hear about her journey there, as well as what a pantomime actually is, what it means to British culture and all that kind of stuff, then please tune in. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss that episode. And all Patreon supporters get access to Monthly M&M 1 month earlier. So everyone on Patreon already listens to the hair episode and the pantomimes episode. And then when the pantomimes episode drops on this feed, I think next week, and there will be a video version at youtube.com/genuinechitchat as well. When that all happens, there'll be a third episode released on Patreon. So if you fancy supporting the show, please go to patreon.com/genuinechitchat, where you not only get early access to M&M monthly by 1 month, but you also get early access to certain Genuine Chit-Chat episodes, and more importantly, you get exclusive content you cannot find anywhere else. So when myself and Megan aren't doing M&M monthly, we are releasing weekly episodes of Afterthoughts. So that is when myself and Megan review movies or TV shows or live performances or things like that. Sometimes holidays we go on, and we do that every single week. And a lot of the time we release 2 episodes in a week as well. So you get access to an exclusive feed if you sign up at Patreon for as little as £1 a month, which I think is about $1.50, and you get immediate access to over 200 episodes of Afterthoughts, and you get early access to monthly M&Ms, and also every week you'll get at least 1 bonus episode of content that you don't get anywhere else. So if you fancy doing that, you can also see other bonus content as well, like future guest lists and submit films for us to watch and those kinds of things. Then please consider going to patreon.com/genuinechitchat. Now, if you want to support the show but you don't want to contribute financially, it's perfectly fine. The best way to do that is to share on social media, tag Mike Chen or whoever the guest of that week is. It really helps get the show like a lot bigger and a lot more people talking about it. In addition to that, you can give a one-off donation at Ko-fi, that's ko-fi.com. You do that, I'll throw you a couple of bonus episodes of Afterthoughts as well. But in addition to that, you can leave reviews. Reviews are incredibly important in the podcasting world, so if you're listening on Spotify, please give a 5-star review. It takes only a few seconds and really makes a big difference. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Audible, anywhere you can leave a review, please leave a 5-star review and write whatever you'd like, and it really helps the show. If you want to interact with myself directly, you can find me at Genuine Chit-Chat on Instagram, on X, on Facebook, on Threads, on TikTok, all those kind of places. And if you're not already subscribed to the YouTube channel, please go and do that, because all my content that I release across various podcasting platforms is all there, as well as playlists where you can find some of the guest spots I've been doing. And there are video versions of the vast majority of conversations I have as well, including this one. So please go on there and you can comment and interact with myself directly as well as you can on social media. In addition to that, friends, I think it's just going to say, keep an eye on what I'm doing in the future. There's some Star Wars guest spots that I'll be doing that are going to be coming out. There's also another Disney discussions on the horizon that we're going to be doing very shortly. There's also, in a couple weeks' time, there's a very interesting conversation I have with someone who has DID, which is dissociative identity disorder. So it's a really, really interesting... Well, the conversation itself is very honest, it's very open, and I really appreciate my guest Lena for being so open about that kind of disorder that a lot of people really don't know about, including myself before I started doing the research on the conversation itself. So just make sure you subscribe. You get access to all of the conversations I have, a lot of nerdy stuff on there, a lot of philosophical and spiritual discussions, but really a lot of human personal stories. They're the kind of things I really like talking about, as well as sci-fi and Star Wars and nerdy stuff. So please subscribe, please share where you can, and please tell Mike Chen how much you enjoyed this conversation, and I'll be getting more Star Wars authors on the podcast in the future as well. But friends, thank you so much for listening to this. I really appreciate each and every one of you listening, especially all the way to the very end. I will speak to you next week, likely with monthly M&M episode 2 pantomimes. So subscribe, and I'll speak to you then.